My son-in-law stood up at Thanksgiving dinner and told 14 guests that I was, in his exact words, just a retired desk clerk who shouldn't be trusted, signing anything important anymore. 6 weeks later, a decorated 2-star general stood up in front of 300 people, saluted me, and called me the bravest man he had ever served beside. Kyle tapped his fork against his wine glass, the way people do when they want a room to fall silent for them. "I think it's time we're honest about something," he said, standing at the head of my own daughter's dining table, in my own daughter's house, on a holiday I had spent 40 years quietly looking forward to. "Hal's getting older. We all love him, but let's be real. He spent his career doing paperwork for the government. That's not exactly a background that prepares someone to be handling important financial decisions for this family." I set down my fork slowly and looked at him. Kyle Draper, 36 years old, a rising commodities trader who had never once, in the 3 years since he'd married my daughter Claire, asked me a single question about the 30 years I'd spent in the Army before I retired. "Kyle," Claire said, her voice tight with embarrassment, "maybe we don't need to do this right now, at dinner." "No, it's fine," Kyle said, waving a hand. "I'm just saying what everyone's already thinking. Hal, no offense, but you were basically a government paper pusher for 3 decades. I don't think that qualifies you to keep serving as executor of Mom's trust, especially now that Claire's pregnant and we need clean, simple decision-making in this family. Claire and I think it makes more sense if I take that role going forward." I looked down the table at my daughter, who wouldn't quite meet my eyes, and then at the folder sitting beside Kyle's plate, a formal document already prepared, my name already typed at the bottom of a resignation of executor form, a yellow arrow sticker pointing helpfully at the signature line. "You brought paperwork to Thanksgiving dinner," I said quietly. "We just wanted to make it easy," Kyle said, sliding the folder toward me. "One signature, and we can all go back to enjoying the holiday." I looked at that folder, then at my granddaughter Emma, 6 years old, coloring quietly in the corner of the room, too young to understand what her father had just called her grandfather, in front of a room full of relatives. "Paperwork clerk," I repeated slowly. "No offense," Kyle said again, in a tone that suggested he'd already decided the offense didn't matter much either way. I picked up the pen sitting beside the folder. Kyle's smile widened, satisfied, the way a man smiles when he believes the hardest part of an evening is already behind him. I set the pen back down without signing anything. "I think I'll keep my role as executor of Margaret's trust exactly as it is," I said. "But thank you for your concern about my paperwork skills." The table went quiet. Kyle's confident expression flickered, just slightly, the way a man's face does when a plan he's rehearsed in his head doesn't go the way he expected out loud. "Dad," Claire said, her voice tightening, "please don't make this difficult." I looked at my daughter, 33 years old, married to a man who had just publicly dismissed 30 years of my life in front of her own child, and asked her to make it easier for him to do it again. "I'm not making anything difficult," I said. "I'm simply saying no." Kyle's jaw tightened, and underneath his practiced confidence, for just a moment, I saw something that looked almost like fear. I had absolutely no idea, sitting at that table, just how quickly and how publicly that fear was about to be justified. 5 weeks earlier. "My name is Harold Bennett. Everyone who's known me more than a week calls me Hal. I spent 31 years in the United States Army, the official record listing most of that time under a fairly unremarkable title, Public Affairs Liaison, stationed at various postings across Europe and the Middle East. That title was accurate exactly as far as it needed to be for most conversations, and it was also, for a significant portion of those 31 years, a carefully maintained cover for classified reconnaissance and intelligence work I am, even now, not permitted to discuss in full detail. I don't say that to boast. I say it because it explains, in part, why my own son-in-law spent 3 years believing I had spent my career filing reports behind a desk in Fort Meade. My wife Margaret and I were married 42 years before ovarian cancer took her 3 years ago. She was the one constant thread running through every posting, every deployment, every long stretch of silence when I couldn't tell her where I was, or when I'd be home. We met at a USO dance outside Fort Benning when I was 23, and she used to say she fell for me because I was the only soldier in the room who asked her a single question about herself before asking her to dance. She built a life for our daughter Claire out of half-truths and long-distance phone calls, and she never once complained about it in all the years I knew her. Margaret had a quiet strength most people underestimated, on first meeting her, the same way people would later underestimate me. She ran our household through 6 different countries, packed and unpacked our lives more times than either of us could count, and somehow made every temporary house feel like home within a week of moving in. She was without question the braver of the two of us, though she would have laughed at anyone who suggested it. Claire grew up mostly on army bases, moving every 2 or 3 years, learning early how to make friends quickly and say goodbye even faster. She used to tell people when she was small that her daddy worked for the government doing important, boring paperwork, which was, again, technically not false, and which I never corrected, because some truths are simply not meant to be handed to a child before she's old enough to carry them responsibly. I missed 2 of her birthdays, one entire Christmas, and her 8th grade graduation, and Margaret always found some way to make my absence feel smaller than it actually was, filming everything on an old camcorder so I could watch it later, sitting alone in a tent thousands of miles away. After I retired, Margaret and I settled into a quiet house outside Savannah, Georgia. She passed 3 years ago, and in the time since, Claire has been, alongside my old army friends, one of the few remaining constants keeping me tethered to something like ordinary life. Claire met Kyle at 29, and he was charming in that easy, confident way certain men are, the kind who fill a room with conversation before anyone's finished their first drink. I wanted to like him. I genuinely tried, for years. But something about the way he spoke about people, sorting them quickly into categories of useful and not useful, always made me quietly uneasy. Margaret, before she passed, had grown uneasy about him too. She never told me the specifics, but about a year before her death, she quietly restructured the small trust she'd built for Claire and our future grandchildren. Education funds set aside from her own modest inheritance, and decades of careful saving, naming me as sole executor, with a clause preventing that role from being transferred to anyone else without my own direct written consent. At the time, I assumed it was simply standard estate planning caution. I would come to understand, months later, that it was something far more specific. After Margaret passed, Kyle and Claire began visiting more often. At first, it felt like exactly the closeness I needed. Sunday dinners, Kyle offering to help with yard work, Claire calling just to check in. Then, slowly, the comments started. You know, Hal, most guys your age with a government pension aren't exactly financial experts. No offense. Claire mentioned you were in the Army a long time. What exactly did you do over there? Paperwork stuff. I just think, realistically, someone with actual financial background should probably be handling important decisions for this family going forward. Small pebbles, never a boulder. I told myself, the way men my age often do, that he simply didn't know any better. About 4 weeks before that Thanksgiving dinner, Kyle came by to help me clear some fallen branches from my yard after a storm. We worked mostly in silence, until he finally asked, almost offhandedly, "So what was your actual job title, over there?" Claire's never really explained it clearly. "Public Affairs Liaison," I said, about as exciting as it sounds most days. He laughed, not unkindly, but with a certain dismissiveness that stayed with me longer than I expected. "Man, I couldn't do a desk job like that for 30 years. No offense, but I need action. Stakes. I don't know how you did that for 3 decades. I should have felt something sharper in that moment. Instead, I simply nodded and let it pass, the way I'd let similar comments pass for 3 years. About 2 weeks before that Thanksgiving dinner, sensing the pressure around the trust slowly building, I drove downtown to see Margaret's old estate attorney, a careful, thorough woman named Susan Whitcomb, who had handled our family's planning for nearly 15 years. "Susan, I want to understand exactly how airtight Margaret's trust structure really is," I told her. "Kyle's been asking pointed questions about the executor role." Susan pulled the file and reviewed it carefully before answering. "Hal, Margaret was very specific about this, more specific than most clients I've worked with. About a year before she passed, she came in alone, without you, and asked me to add a clause preventing the executor role from being reassigned to anyone other than you without your own direct written consent, regardless of any future family pressure or claimed hardship." "Did she say why?" I asked. Susan hesitated, choosing her words carefully. She mentioned, generally, that she'd observed some concerning patterns in how Kyle spoke about money and family obligation, and she wanted the children's education funds protected specifically from that dynamic, whatever form it eventually took. "She trusted your judgment completely, Hal. She built this specifically so that trust wouldn't have to depend on anyone else's." I sat with that for a long moment. "So there's no legal pathway for Kyle to remove me as executor?" "None," Susan confirmed. "Not without a court finding of serious incapacity, which, frankly, nothing in your record would remotely support. The trust is exactly as protected today as the day Margaret signed it." I left Susan's office that afternoon with a strange, steadying mixture of grief and quiet gratitude. Margaret had seen this coming, in some form, long before either of us could have named it clearly. A week later, my old friend and former unit sergeant, retired Command Sergeant Major Nathaniel Ellison, everyone still calls him Doc, from his years running our field medical logistics, called me out of the blue. "Hal, you seen the guest list for the Army Ranger Association Gala next month?" "Can't say I have, Doc. General Patricia Renfro's the keynote this year. 2-star. She's presenting the Community Leadership Honors." I sat with that a moment. Patricia Renfro. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in almost 15 years, though I thought of her more often than I let on. Mostly late at night, mostly during the anniversary of an operation neither of us has ever been permitted to fully discuss. "You going?" Doc asked. "Hadn't planned on it." "You should reconsider," he said. "I've got a feeling this one's worth showing up for." I thought he meant simply reconnecting with old friends. I would come to understand, weeks later, that he meant something far more specific. Around that same time, an envelope arrived from the Army Ranger Association's regional office, formal cream-colored stationery, my name printed carefully across the front. I set it on my kitchen counter, told myself I'd deal with it once the holiday chaos settled down, and let it sit there, unopened, for nearly 2 weeks. That, I can tell you now, was very nearly a costly oversight. If a formal envelope like that arrives unexpectedly, open it immediately. You never know exactly what's waiting inside. Meanwhile, unknown to me, Kyle's trading position had taken a serious hit. He had leveraged heavily into a commodities bet that had gone badly wrong over the previous 6 months, and rather than admitting the losses to Claire, he had quietly been searching for any accessible source of family capital to cover the shortfall before his firm's compliance department noticed the irregularities in his personal accounts. Margaret's modest trust, roughly $190,000, set aside for Claire and our future grandchildren's education, was the closest, cleanest source of money he could see, if only he could remove me as the executor standing between him and access to it. Of course, I knew none of this yet. Whenever Kyle visited, he was cordial, occasionally condescending, but never openly hostile. Whenever Claire hugged me goodbye, I hugged her back and told myself, hopefully, that my daughter's family was simply settling into the ordinary rhythms of married life. Then came Thanksgiving, the folder, the pen I refused to pick up, and the words paperwork clerk, spoken in front of my own 6-year-old granddaughter. After I said no that night, the table sat in an uncomfortable silence. Kyle quickly tried to paper over, with a joke about the cranberry sauce. Claire barely spoke to me for the rest of the evening. When we said goodbye at the door, she hugged me stiffly and said, "We'll figure this out later, Dad," in a tone that sounded far more like an ultimatum than a promise. I drove home that night, replaying the flicker of fear I'd seen cross Kyle's face when I set that pen down. Something told me this conversation was far from finished. I was right. 3 days later, I finally opened the envelope that had been sitting on my counter for nearly 2 weeks. It was a formal invitation from the Army Ranger Association, confirming my attendance had been specifically requested at the upcoming regional gala, where, the letter explained, several distinguished honors would be presented, including a long-delayed formal recognition ceremony for classified operations personnel whose contributions, due to security restrictions, had never been publicly acknowledged during their years of active service. Attached was a smaller note, handwritten, from Doc Ellison. It read simply, "Hal, this one's for you. Wear the good suit. Trust me." I called Doc immediately. "What exactly is going on here?" I asked. He laughed, warm and a little mysterious. "Some things got declassified last year, Hal. Recognition committee's been working on this for months. Renfro specifically asked that you be there. I think you'd better just show up and see for yourself." That same week, Kyle called me directly, his voice noticeably tighter than his usual confident tone. "Hal, I wanted to follow up about the executor paperwork." "I already gave you my answer, Kyle. I understand you're attached to the role," he said, "but realistically, Claire and I really do think it makes more sense for me to take over management of the trust, especially with the baby coming." "Kyle," I said calmly, "that trust was structured by Margaret specifically to prevent it from being transferred to anyone other than me without my direct written consent. That protection exists for a reason, and I have no intention of removing it." There was a long pause on the line. "That's not possible," he finally said. "There's no way a government paperwork job pays for lawyers sharp enough to lock something down that tightly. You'd be surprised what 31 years in this country's service can quietly arrange," I said, and left it there. 3 days after that call, Claire showed up at my house unannounced, alone, looking pale and unsettled in a way I hadn't seen since Margaret's funeral. "Dad, Kyle had a lawyer draft something," she said, sitting down heavily at my kitchen table. "A petition. To have you evaluated for capacity. He said it was just a precaution, in case you ever became unable to manage things yourself. But Dad, he wanted me to sign it without telling you first." My chest tightened. Did you sign it? No, she said quickly. I couldn't. Something about it felt wrong, even before I understood exactly why. She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed. He's scared about something, Dad. I can feel it. He won't tell me what. Has he said anything about his work? About money? She shook her head slowly. He's been on his phone constantly. Short with me, short with Emma. I thought it was just stress from the promotion track at his firm. I reached across the table and took her hand. Claire, whatever is going on with Kyle, I need you to promise me you won't sign anything. About me, about the trust, about anything, without giving yourself time to think it through clearly, away from pressure. I promise, she said quietly. I should have promised that a long time ago, honestly. She left an hour later, calmer but visibly shaken, and I sat alone at that kitchen table for a long while afterward, aware that whatever was building beneath the surface of my daughter's marriage was moving faster and more urgently than either of us had yet fully understood. The gala arrived the following week, held in a large hotel ballroom downtown, packed with nearly 300 veterans, active duty officers, and their families. Doc met me at the entrance, grinning like a man holding onto a secret he was thoroughly enjoying keeping. Wear the good suit, I said, he reminded me, straightening my lapel like a proud older brother. Look at you, sharp as ever. I hadn't told Claire or Kyle where I was going that evening, which, as it turned out, mattered a great deal, because roughly an hour into the program, after several standard commendation presentations, General Patricia Renfro stepped up to the podium for what the printed program simply listed as special recognition. Many of you in this room tonight, she began, her voice carrying easily across the ballroom, served alongside men and women whose full contributions you were never permitted to know due to the classified nature of their assignments. Tonight, following recent declassification review, we have the honor of formally acknowledging one of those individuals. My stomach tightened slightly as she continued. In 1994, during a covert extraction operation in circumstances I am still only partially able to describe publicly, even tonight, a small reconnaissance team, under my command, was compromised deep behind hostile lines. One member of that team, operating under the cover title of Public Affairs Liaison, made the decision to remain behind, alone, to draw hostile attention away from the rest of us during our extraction, at extraordinary personal risk, asking for no recognition, expecting none, and receiving none publicly for the better part of 30 years. I felt my chest tighten as nearly 300 faces in that room began turning, slowly, in my direction. Several people near me clearly putting the pieces together in real time. That man is here with us tonight, General Renfro said. Colonel Harold Bennett, would you please stand? I stood slowly, my hands unsteady in a way they hadn't been in years, my dress uniform jacket, the one Margaret had pressed and hung in the closet for exactly this kind of occasion for decades, without ever getting the chance to see me wear it to something like this, suddenly feeling heavier on my shoulders than I remembered. What happened next, I will admit, I did not entirely expect. Nearly the entire room rose to its feet at once, veterans across 3 different generations of service, standing in near unison, several of them, out of old habit and deep respect, snapping to a formal salute. Somewhere near the back, I heard someone begin clapping, and within seconds, it had spread through the entire ballroom, nearly 300 people on their feet, the sound rolling over me in waves I genuinely didn't know how to absorb all at once. General Renfro crossed the stage, stopped directly in front of me, and returned that same salute before shaking my hand firmly. You saved 11 lives that night, Colonel, she said quietly. Just for me. Her eyes bright with something that looked very much like held-back tears, including mine. It's long past time the world outside that unit knew it. She turned back to the microphone. For those unfamiliar with the details, and most of you rightfully are, Colonel Bennett spent 31 years of his career operating primarily under a deliberately unremarkable cover title, precisely so that men and women like the 11 of us extracted that night could go home to our own families. He never once, in all the years I've known him personally, sought recognition for it. Tonight, we simply felt it was time he received some anyway. I don't remember every detail of what happened over the following several minutes. The applause, the photographs, Doc gripping my shoulder with tears, openly running down his face, saying something I couldn't quite hear over the noise of the room. What I remember most clearly is looking out across that crowded ballroom and seeing, standing near the back entrance, having arrived late and clearly uncertain whether they were even in the right place, my daughter Claire and her husband Kyle. Claire's hand was pressed over her mouth. Kyle simply stood there, completely still, his face drained of every ounce of its usual confidence. Doc later told me Claire had called him earlier that week, quietly worried about the tension building at home, and he'd suggested, without fully explaining why, that she and Kyle come to the gala that evening. After the ceremony finished, Claire pushed through the crowd toward me, tears streaming freely down her face. "Dad, I had no idea. Any of it. Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Some things aren't mine to tell," I said gently. "Even to you." She threw her arms around me, holding on tighter than she had in years. "And all those years I told my friends you did boring paperwork for the government," she said into my shoulder. "I actually believed it myself, most days. I never once thought to ask harder questions. You were a child, Claire. Children believe what their parents tell them. That's not a failure on your part." She pulled back, wiping her eyes. "Kyle's been saying things about you for 3 years, Dad. Dismissive things. And I let it slide, because it was easier than defending you against something I didn't even understand myself." "You're defending me now," I said. "That's what matters." "I should have asked you years ago," she said. "About all of it, not just tonight because a general told me who you really were." "You're asking now," I told her. "That still counts for something, Claire." She hugged me again, and over her shoulder, I watched Kyle standing a few feet away, still visibly shaken, waiting for his turn to say something he clearly hadn't yet found the words for. Kyle approached more slowly, visibly shaken, extending a hand that trembled slightly as I shook it. "Colonel Bennett," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology I don't even know how to fully put into words right now." "We'll talk," I told him, "just not tonight." We did talk, 3 days later, at my kitchen table, the same table where Margaret and I had once planned Claire's own wedding decades earlier. "I called you a paperwork clerk in front of your own granddaughter," Kyle said, staring down at his hands. "I've been replaying that all week." "You did," I agreed. "I need to tell you something else," he said, his voice unsteady. "The reason I wanted control of the trust. I've been hiding significant trading losses from Claire for months. I was desperate, and I convinced myself pushing you out was about protecting the family, when really, it was about protecting myself." "How bad is it?" I asked. He rubbed both hands over his face. "Bad enough that my firm's compliance office is going to find it within the quarter, regardless of what I do. I leveraged a position I shouldn't have touched, chasing a loss instead of cutting it early, the way anyone with real discipline would have." "Why didn't you just tell Claire from the beginning?" I asked. "Because I built my entire relationship with her on being the one who had everything figured out," he said quietly. "Confident, in control. Admitting I'd made a serious mistake felt like admitting the whole foundation was fake. Nothing built on that kind of performance holds up for very long," I said. "I learned that lesson a different way, but I learned it eventually too." He looked up at me. "How did you carry it, all those years, not being able to tell people the truth about what you actually did?" "Carefully," I said, "and not alone. Margaret knew enough to support me, even without knowing everything. You have that option too, Kyle, if you're willing to actually use it instead of hiding behind it." "I appreciate you telling me directly," I said. "That took more honesty than the folder you brought to Thanksgiving." He nodded, ashamed. "I don't expect you to just move past this." "I don't expect that either," I said. "But I appreciate that you're finally telling the truth. To me, and I hope, to Claire." Over the following weeks, Kyle disclosed the full extent of his losses to Claire, and to his firm's compliance office, voluntarily, before anyone forced the issue. He began working with a financial counselor to rebuild both his professional standing and, more importantly, his marriage. The trust remained exactly as Margaret had structured it, untouched, protected, waiting patiently for Emma, and whatever new grandchild was on the way, to grow old enough to use it exactly as she'd intended. Emma, for her part, remained blissfully unaware of most of the adult tensions surrounding her that autumn, though she'd clearly absorbed something of the strange formality of that ballroom evening. About a week after the gala, she called me on Claire's phone, her small voice full of urgent curiosity. "Grandpa, Daddy said you're famous now." I laughed. "Not exactly famous, sweetheart. He said people stood up and saluted you." "What does saluted mean?" "It's a way soldiers show respect to each other," I told her. "Were you scared?" she asked. "When you were a soldier?" I thought about that question longer than a 6-year-old probably expected me to. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I always tried to remember that being scared, and doing the right thing anyway, isn't a contradiction, Emma. Most of the bravest people I ever knew were scared plenty of times." "I get scared of the dark," she said seriously. "That's all right too," I told her. "Everybody's got something." Doc drove me home from the gala that night, both of us mostly quiet in the car, still absorbing everything that had happened. We ended up sitting in his truck in my driveway for nearly an hour afterward, neither of us quite ready to end the evening. "You knew this was coming," I said. "The whole time. That's why you told me to wear the good suit." I had a hunch, Doc admitted. Renfro's been pushing for that declassification review for almost 2 years. When she finally told me it went through, I figured you deserved to hear it from a room full of people who understood exactly what it meant, instead of a letter in the mail. You could have just told me directly, I said. Could have, he agreed, grinning. But where's the poetry in that, Hal? Some things deserve a little ceremony. We sat in silence for a moment, the truck's engine ticking quietly as it cooled. You ever regret it? Doc asked eventually. 31 years of people thinking you filed paperwork for a living? I thought about that honestly before answering. Some days, I admitted. Mostly the days Claire was young, and I couldn't explain why I'd missed something important. But no, not really. Not on the whole. I did what needed doing. The recognition was never really the point. No, Doc agreed quietly, but it's not nothing either, finally getting it. No, I said, it's not nothing. 3 days later, Kyle called and asked if he could come by to talk. He arrived at my kitchen table looking like a man who hadn't slept properly in several nights, and it was there, over 2 cups of coffee neither of us finished, that he finally told me the whole truth. I keep thinking about that ballroom, he admitted. 300 people standing up for you, and I'd spent 3 years thinking you were just some boring old government employee. Most heroism doesn't announce itself, Kyle, I said. Most of it looks remarkably ordinary from the outside, right up until the moment it doesn't. He was quiet for a long moment. I think I judged you by what I could immediately see, he said, instead of taking the time to actually find out who you were. And if I'm honest, I think I did the same thing to myself. I built this whole identity around being sharp, successful, always ahead of everyone else, and the second that image started cracking, I panicked instead of just telling my wife and her father the truth. What finally made you decide to tell Claire everything? I asked. He looked out the kitchen window at the darkening yard for a moment before answering. Watching you stand up in that ballroom, he said. Watching what it actually looks like when someone spends decades quietly doing the right thing instead of just performing confidence. I realized I'd been performing my entire career, and it had finally caught up with me. That's a harder thing to admit than most people manage in a lifetime, I told him honestly. I'm working on it, he said. The financial counselor. Being straight with Claire, actually asking you questions instead of assuming I already had you figured out. I've noticed, I said. It matters. Emma turned 7 that spring, and for her birthday, Kyle surprised me by asking if I'd come to her school for career day, not to talk about trading commodities, but to talk, in whatever careful, age-appropriate way I could manage, about service, sacrifice, and quiet courage. I spent nearly a week deciding what I could actually say to a room full of 7-year-olds without either boring them or saying something I wasn't permitted to share. In the end, I brought a few old photographs, my dress uniform jacket for them to look at, and a simple story about teamwork, about how sometimes the most important job in any group isn't the flashiest one, it's the one nobody else wants, done quietly and well. Did you fight bad guys? One boy in the front row asked immediately, before I'd even finished introducing myself. Sometimes, I told him honestly, but mostly, my job was making sure my friends made it home safely. That mattered more to me than anything else. Emma sat in the front row the entire time, practically vibrating with pride, occasionally leaning over to whisper to the girl beside her, "That's my grandpa," as though it were the most obvious and wonderful fact in the world. Standing in front of that classroom, watching my granddaughter beam proudly from the front row, I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled since long before that Thanksgiving dinner. If you've stayed with me this long, here is what I hope you take from my story. People are so often quick to measure a person's worth by the small slice of them visible on the surface: a job title, a quiet demeanor, an unassuming pension. Real value, real character, is almost always built somewhere deeper, somewhere most people never think to look until circumstances finally force them to. I think often about Margaret, sitting alone in that attorney's office a year before she passed, quietly protecting a future she wouldn't live to see, based on instincts about a son-in-law she never explained fully, even to me. She never got the chance to stand in that ballroom and watch 300 people rise to their feet. But in her own quiet way, she'd already understood something that took the rest of us far longer to learn, that the people who protect us most fiercely are often the ones least interested in being thanked for it publicly. I think, too, about the 31 years I spent letting an unremarkable job title stand in for the truth, not out of shame, but out of necessity, and how easily that necessity became, over time, something close to invisibility, even within my own family. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being underestimated by the people who love you most, one I carried quietly for far longer than I ever admitted, even to myself. If someone in your life seems quieter or more unassuming than you expect, consider that you may simply not yet know their whole story. And if you're ever tempted to dismiss someone you love based on what little you can see from the outside, I hope you take the time to look closer before a stranger has to stand up in a crowded room and show you what you should have already known. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, I would be honored if you shared it with them. And if you'd like more stories about family, quiet sacrifice, and the truth that always seems to find its way home eventually, stay close. There are more stories still to come. Thank you for spending this time with me.